Well, thank you for joining me watching this kind of summary of the book we are reading together, Anxious to Talk About It, How to Help White Christians Talk Faithfully About Race. And there are 6 chapters. It's a real thin book. You can probably read it in one sitting, in just an hour or so. But we're going to do it over 6 weeks. We can really dig into the different things that are said because it's so easy just to kind of skim over it, think we understand it, think we've really thought about what it's asking us to think about. But we're going to take it slowly. And each week I'll do a video kind of going through what we're talking about on the Facebook page as well, in case you aren't able to get on Facebook. So in the introduction, the author Brenda Hassel shares her own anxiety with talking about race and asks, what are the sources of your anxiety as you think about race? She goes on to share, if you are a perfectionist, perhaps the anxiety comes from past experiences of not knowing the right answer, of trying to do something good only to have someone misinterpret your actions. If you get defensive when the subject is raised, perhaps it comes out of an anxiety that you will wrongfully be accused of being racist. If you generally think of yourself as a good person, perhaps this subject creates anxiety that you will never be able to be good enough when it comes to race because you are a white person. I wonder if you'd kind of think about your sources of anxiety as you think about race. For me, I think I'm afraid of messing up and doing it wrong. That nothing I will say will make everyone happy. Somebody will get mad no matter what. I won't go far enough. I'll go too far. I'm afraid I might use language that is offensive to someone or not articulate something clearly enough that it causes a misunderstanding. Emotions run high, and I don't want to cause more hurt with my words. I don't want to be guilty of microaggressions, which is why I'm really trying to learn more before I speak. And then I'm really trying to speak with humility that assumes I'm not going to say everything right. I'm learning from my friends who are black that they appreciate my willingness to engage in humility when I do engage in these subjects, and are giving me a lot of grace and instructing me when I do need instruction. That, hey, I get what you were trying to say here, but it didn't come off the way you wanted it to, or you left out this bit, or something like that. I wonder if you have similar anxieties. Hessel, the author, also tells a story of someone who believes to have been the victim of reverse racism. She kind of goes through these stories of these ideas we sometimes think about when it comes to race. The things that kind of we instinctively say about reverse racism. We're a melting pot of all kinds of people. But I wonder if you have ever heard or used the term reverse racism. So she writes, in talking about race with white people, the emotions related to whiteness impact how we see the world. When anti-racist trainers introduce the statement racism is prejudice plus power, white persons may not see themselves as powerful, and this feeling prevents them from viewing whites as a racial group continuing to hold the greatest power in our society. So as we might say, I don't have any power, I still live in poverty, I've had to come from nothing, I don't have a voice, and so that keeps us from really being able to see the larger picture. So I wonder what your initial reactions to the definition of racism is prejudice plus power. So I admit to using the term reverse racism in junior high and high school. I didn't understand the difference between racism and prejudice. Anyone can be prejudiced and act on it, but not everyone has the systemic power behind their prejudice to discriminate in ways that have negative consequences to a whole people group and not just an individual. I may have experienced someone's personal prejudice that had a negative impact on me as an individual, but I have not experienced racism because there isn't systemic discrimination based on my race. Now, of course, my understanding of these nuances and differences is relatively recent. I cried reverse racism as a youth because I wanted to see myself as the victim, the oppressed and not the oppressor. None of us want to see ourselves as the oppressor, as the bad guy, so to speak, or even on the bad side. So we try to make the other side just as bad or make ourselves feel victimized too. It's a logical fallacy called the tu quoque fallacy, or Latin for you also. It's the whataboutism. Like, well, you did this too, so it cancels each other out. It's like in football when two penalties happen on the same play between two teams, they just cancel each other out. That's what we hope to do with this fallacy when we say, oh, reverse racism, now we don't have to talk about it because we're all just as guilty. It's really a type of ad hominem attack that is an invalid attempt to discredit an opponent by answering criticism with criticism. It allows ourselves to let ourselves off the hook by saying, well, what about when you did this? I've been guilty of that. I need to understand that while I may not feel like I have power, I actually have a lot. See, power often controls and abuses what power thinks it can get away with. The fact that I'm white gives me enough power that certain acts and abuses are less likely to happen to me. The fact that I'm a middle-class white male gives me even more. There is more of an assumption that doing something to abuse or mistreat me may come back to hurt the perpetrator in some way, so I'm safer. Power often goes for the low-hanging fruit, which is why we often see abuse among populations with less overall societal power. The homeless, children, black and brown citizens, even women. When white people are prejudiced, we have the power behind us to create systems of discrimination. In fact, we've done it. Hopefully, you've been doing some of these readings and watchings on the 21-Day Race Equity Challenge, which has dug into some of the history that shows how our prejudice plus our power has created systemic racism. And while we may not have built the systems ourselves, whether we have wanted to or not, we've benefited from the systems and done little to take the systems down. So, speaking of systems, we want to make the systemic personal. It's easier to handle the personal and think about it. If we make the systemic personal, we can also say, it's them, not me. Or we can lift up our own personal experience in a way that trumps the systemic reality. At least for ourselves, this is the power of stories. Stories share how we think and feel, but sometimes we can become so embedded in our own stories, we can miss the larger story. We sometimes aren't willing to hear someone else's story because we prioritize our own. So I wonder if you have a story about race that you think shapes your understanding, your gut reaction to racial things. Have you heard someone else's story that made you rethink your own and see the bigger picture you really hadn't seen before? Confession time. One memory that sticks out for me is from junior high. I went to a school with a predominantly black student body. I remember hearing an announcement one day about a scholarship for black students, and I was angry. That was my initial gut reaction. Why couldn't I apply? It wasn't fair that there was a scholarship for black students and not white students. I was seeing more and more special things for black students and beginning to feel mistreated because I didn't have those special opportunities. Now, in elementary school, I went to a predominantly white school. There was no need for this. I didn't have an understanding of the larger issues of fairness in the world. I hadn't learned about redlining and how the best schools were only for white students for so long. I didn't know about even just the idea of property taxes going to fund schools. So the elementary school I went to was the best funded. Now, the elementary schools that my classmates in junior high went to were the least funded. I didn't have any of that larger picture. I just knew there was a scholarship, a prize I didn't get to apply for or win. I was being mistreated. That's that personal. It's all about me. See, I didn't realize then that I had so many other advantages that the black students at my school didn't have. I just saw something special, and in my own selfishness, I wanted that too. I didn't know that equality isn't equity. Do you know that distinction? Sometimes all things shouldn't be equal, they should be equitable. There's this graphic I've always found helpful. It's of three kids of different heights trying to see over a fence to see a baseball game. Only the tallest kid is able to barely see over the fence and see the game. Equality would be giving all of the three kids one box to stand on. Now the kid who could already see sees better. One kid who's just a little bit shorter can now see, but the shortest kid on the one box still can't see. That's equality, but the results aren't equitable. So, equitable would be saying, give no boxes to the one person who could already see, give one box to the person who just needed that one box to see, and give two boxes to the third kid, so now all can see at the same level. That would be giving different things to create equitable results. Now, that fence is a solid wood fence. Changing the whole system would be to take out the wooden fence and put in a chain link fence, and now everyone is able to see the same. There's a big difference between equality and equity. See, I wanted what the black students were getting that may help them just get a little bit closer to what I had. But I wanted that too so I could soar even higher above them. I didn't think of it that way. But that's what the results would have been. I've carried those memories of what I considered unfair for a really long time, and I think it has affected my understanding of race. I never thought of it as being racist. I thought of it as a fairness issue. But I only saw a small piece of the larger picture. So the author shares the origins also in this chapter 1 of the phrase Black Lives Matter. And it goes all the way back to Trayvon Martin's death. And she writes, and then it builds with Michael Brown and Ferguson, and kind of people take this phrase that came out of Trayvon Martin's death when somebody was writing, hey, Black Lives Matter too, why can't we ever get justice? So she writes, the author, in response to the Black Lives Matter phrase gaining support, some white people took offense. People began posting all lives matter. These reactions missed the point. What the original writers were expressing is that black lives matter too, because of how often they had seen black people shot without any repercussion for the shooter. The people who lifted up Black Lives Matter did so as a protest, a cry against the injustice they witnessed on a regular basis. Hustle, the author, goes on to share stories of other deaths of black people that resulted in few repercussions for the shooters. She then challenges us to do an internet search of the list of names of people of color who have been killed by police officers or in custody whose deaths led to no conviction. She writes, if you as a white person were seeing this happen to people who looked like you, people who looked like your brother or sister, parent or child, how would these stories impact you emotionally? What would it feel like to have so many people who look like you killed by police and see court case after court case end with no conviction for the officers? Would you be enraged? Terrified? So how do you think you would react and feel? What was your original reaction to hearing Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter? Do you have any new thoughts about it now? For me, I first heard about Black Lives Matter during the Ferguson protests, and I didn't really know the origin story until people started saying all lives matter. It's easy to say all when we aren't the ones currently suffering the most. I can't imagine the fear, the hurt, and anger the black community must have. I know if I had a child of color, I would be raging right now and full of fear every single day. It's a sign of privilege that I don't have to deal with those emotions. I can put them aside, ignore them. Other people can't just ignore the problem. But I listen to my friends, black pastors, business leaders, military officers, and time again, they tell me of their constant fear. They tell me horrifying stories of being intimidated by police, even arrested going into their own neighborhoods. They share stories of verbal and physical abuse, which they can do nothing about, but just take it, because they could get worse if they say or do anything. These are friends who are educated, articulate, strong, passionate, have good jobs, are leaders in the community, and it still happens to them. They are not immune to the pain. So I want to be very clear, and I've had to learn this. I wasn't there first off, but I've learned that saying all lives matter is one of the most racist and privileged things you can say right now. And I know people get defensive about that, and that's an example of white fragility right there. We'll get to that later. But I've come to understand this slowly, because on the surface, it seems like widening the scope of love and mattering is a good thing. But sometimes we can include so many that it becomes meaningless. If everything is included the exact same way, then nothing gets specialized, focused attention, and sometimes that is needed. Sometimes to blunt the pain or to take away a focus, we widen it so it's dispersed over a large area and we don't have to focus anymore. It is actually a potentially, it is an on-purpose attempt to take away the force of Black Lives Matter, to again say you don't actually matter, because we're diluting it so much. I mean, if you are wanting to taste something, but you put a little bit of chocolate syrup in a gallon of milk, you're not going to taste the chocolate at all, because it's so watered down by all. But if you put a drop of chocolate syrup in a teeny bit of milk, it's going to be a very chocolatey milk. Sometimes we dilute on purpose, and All Lives Matter was meant to dilute Black Lives Matter. So I want you to imagine you have cancer in one particular part of your body, and some of you have had this happen. You might need targeted radiation treatment. You don't want to irradiate your entire body. You need precision to get at the problem. That's the point of Black Lives Matter. Let's look at the problem area and focus our attention and our solutions there. When Jesus tells the story of leaving the 99 sheep to find one, he isn't suggesting the 99 don't matter. He's affirming that the one sheep that is in particular trouble needs to have the focus in that moment. When Jesus says, "Let the children come to me," he didn't say, "Let everyone come." He says that other times, but at that moment, people were keeping children from him, so he focused his attention and said, "Let the children come." The disciples weren't not like, "Hey, Jesus, let everyone come. Why are you so focused on only children matter? Everyone should get to come to you." No, they understood what he was trying to say in that moment. Children needed the focus in that particular context. When we say support the troops in times of war, no one says support everyone. Of course we should support all our neighbors at all times, but in that specific time, the armed forces and their families need particular support and attention. I mean, seriously, in times of war and things, when people say support the troops, have there been signs up counterbalancing them that say support everyone? I see support the troops signs that I've never once seen a support everyone sign. If that's not the case, do you think maybe the All Lives Matter thing is actually pretty darn racially motivated? Yes. I mean, many have no problem saying God bless America, because we want a special focus on our country at specific times like July 4th. But doesn't God bless all nations? Don't all nations matter to God? We know that. We're not saying that all nations don't matter. We just want to lift up our particular one at a particular moment. So why is it that people can't say Black Lives Matter when there's a particular problem that needs to be focused on? Maybe it's because we don't want to actually focus on the Black lives. And that's the embedded inherent racism in each of us. Because you see, the black community has felt they do not matter to America. And I can't say that history offers much of a different message. They need affirmation and action. They are hurting. By saying all lives matter, what the black community hears is, we don't want to affirm you matter. We don't want to focus on the problems you face. We want to say all so we can continue to feel justified in focusing on ourselves because we're part of the all. Sometimes all is another way of saying none and no. It gives us permission to focus where we want to focus rather than where we need to focus. So Hassel continues to write, the Broadway musical South Pacific includes a song, You've Got to Be Carefully Taught, which portrays the process of educating persons into racism. Racist beliefs are beliefs that persons learn while growing up in order to function more effectively in society. The assumption has been that if persons could be educated into racism, then they could be educated out of racism. But in changing the emotions surrounding how we interpret racism, education is not a simple process of passing information on that someone else receives and accepts as true. There are stories that have already been a part of our understanding of racism that we need to better understand and try to re-narrate. There are also emotional components that have to do with recognizing oneself in the story. So can you identify any stories from your past that might have contributed to your own implicit bias and understanding of race and racism? Do you struggle to find yourself in the story of America's racist legacy? Why or why not? You see, I don't want to be a part of America's racist legacy, but I know I am. I've benefited from it, and I haven't done much of anything to dismantle it. I'd already admitted struggling to understanding why black students had some special opportunities I did not in junior high. I did not know then about their daily struggles and challenges. Of course, I never tried to learn about them either. Now, in high school, there was a rule that the president and the vice president of the student body had to be two different races. So they had two different elections, so they know which was which. And I thought that was unfair again. There it is with me and fair. So I challenged the system. What they were trying to make equitable, I was trying to tip the scales. I wanted a white person to be able to run for vice president even though we had a white president. Now, I didn't consider myself racist. I had black friends. It's not that I didn't want a black vice president. I thought it was an issue of fairness. Again, I didn't understand the difference between equality and equity. I had also seen where the local NAACP was advocating for more black teachers and administrators. I didn't know then about the importance of representation. I didn't realize the need for different perspectives or for black students to have those role models and leaders to look up to. I just thought it wasn't fair because some good white teachers wouldn't get jobs because of it. I didn't realize it, but it was so ingrained in me to be more concerned about white teachers than black teachers. I didn't know the unemployment statistics or the disparity between the numbers of white and black teachers. And again, I couched it in the language of fairness. I didn't know better, but like with All Lives Matter, I was using a veil of fairness to cover my inherent racism. To make matters worse, and I really hate to share this, I created a little group of my friends called the NAASWP, the National Association for the Advancement of Southern White People. Man, was I an idiot. Again, I thought if there was a group for black people, why not for white people? I knew so little about equity and real fairness. I was naive and foolish. I was one of those stupid high school kids that had the Confederate flag license tag on the front of my car, and I was one of those who claimed it was heritage, not hate, but never considered how it made anyone feel. I was selfish and stupid. I had ingrained racism that I treated as fairness and equality, and sometimes I find myself falling into that trap still. I wonder if you do too. So at the end of the first chapter, the author talks about her own journey of understanding race and racism and her own whiteness. She said it was helpful to know guilt and shame wasn't the end goal, but she also had to address the concept of white fragility. She writes, racial justice educator Robin DiAngelo says white people suffer from white fragility when it comes to encountering conversations about race. She argues that the emotions of white people often get in the way of learning about the realities of racism because white people often live segregated from the racial stress, noting that when whites first experience it, they often react defensively, expressing outward anger, arguing, or withdrawing completely. We need to consider the emotions we experience when talking about race and become able to sit with them and honor them rather than withdrawing. So, what feelings do you have when you talk or learn about race and racism? Do you find yourself getting defensive, trying to argue why it's not as bad as people make it out or why you're really a victim too? Are you comfortable with those feelings yet? And I admit, I definitely have felt defensive. I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to be on the wrong side. I get defensive because I don't want to have to admit my faults and my complicity, so I try to make excuses or say it's not me or not all white people, and I try to wash my hands like Pilate. I still have feelings of guilt and of shame, and that if I'm not careful turns to anger and defensiveness. I have to confess my sins every Sunday. I have to remember that I don't have to be a perfect anti-racist. I can acknowledge my own racism and still be an anti-racist ally, just like I can confess my sin every week and still be a Christian. And I appreciate you reading chapter 1 of the book, and if you don't have the book and you're just listening to this to get an overview, I appreciate you taking the time to do so. I appreciate the grace you extend to me as I share some of these embarrassing things from my own past and the ways I used to think. Like many of all of us, I'm a recovering racist. I have to admit that. The first step is admitting I have those racist tendencies, those ingrained thoughts in me. And if I do nothing about it, it's just going to get worse. So thank you for joining me on this journey with me.